Welcome to part two on Andrew Jackson. Throughout these next two episodes, we'll kind of be asking ourselves, was Andrew Jackson, who's kind of one of the presidents I like to kind of look at the most and study, was he the common man's president or was he King Andrew? Now, you see, Andrew Jackson kind of was truly a champion of the common man. After all, this was the first president kind of raised west of the Appalachians, as he came from Tennessee, kind of the backwoods. He grew up with very little education, kind of taught himself to be a lawyer. He was a guy with a very fiery temper. He would hold a grudge, kind of never forgot if something was done to him. He always wanted to get even. In fact, he goes through life, fighting many duels and challenging men to brawls and fights. And he even, in one duel, kills a man, and another one, he'll be shot and wounded and bleeding before he raises his gun up and fires back, kind of showing how tough he was. But this was, after all, after he was upset by losing the 24 election due to the corrupt bargain. He had set himself out and had kind of had grassroots efforts created in almost every state to try to help him with his Democratic platform, and it helped him defeat the incumbent, John Quincy Adams. And his faith in the common man may have stemmed from his childhood, where his father had died, and him and his brothers had joined the Revolutionary War, and it kind of showed his temper and his strong will when he was actually taken prisoner along with his brother by the British. And one of the British officers told the young Andrew Jackson to shine his boot. And when Jackson refused, the officer took out his sword and struck him. But he does gain fame, like I'd mentioned, as a military hero. He does defeat the natives. He does defeat the British in the Battle of New Orleans. And then he rises through the political system to win the presidency. And as president, he'll be very distrustful of monopolies and big business and the rich. He'll actually strengthen the power of the presidency and kind of make it equal to that of Congress. He'll defend the Union, and he'll kind of help continue the push towards more democratic reforms in the United States. But sadly, before he has an opportunity to enter the White House, his wife, who was taken back by all these verbal assaults upon her character during the 1828 election, actually passes away after he wins the election, but before he enters the White House. And so Jackson will be sworn in with a heavy heart, as he had always wanted to defend his wife's honor. And when she was being called, an adulterer and a bigamist, he couldn't stand it, and he kind of upset him, and it'll kind of influence him later on in his presidency. But with the support of the common man and Catholics and immigrants and frontiersmen, he also had the support of the planter elite, which he had promised to remove the natives from the southeastern part of the United States to kind of drum up their support. And he had a lot of support in the South because of that. But he had the support of the frontiersmen, also because he promised to remove the Indians. He had the distrust of big money. He feared that money could become too powerful and threaten America's democracy, and because of that distrusted the industries and monopolies and banks. And so with this, his opponents kind of feared that the rule of kind of king mob, commoners kind of taking over and kind of destroying our country. But Jackson had that faith that common people were capable of uncommon achievements. Now, one of the issues that arose for the Jackson administration became known as the nullification issue. What had happened was the Congress in 1828 had passed what became known as the Tariff of Abomination. Now, what this did was basically raise the tariff rates to a very high rate. It was a very kind of protectionist tariff. meant to try to protect our home market and our home industry and kind of keep the flood of cheaper European goods out. Now, what happened was, and this kind of starts to show the rift between Jackson's vice president, who happens to be John C. Calhoun, the guy we've mentioned several times already, and he's from South Carolina. And South Carolina will kind of lead this charge against nullifying or voiding this federal tariff. Now, some southern states wanted to kind of argue how tariffs only benefited the North, they hurt the South, because by arguing this issue, it kind of kept slavery on a back burner. But what happens is you have the Webster-Hayne debate, where Daniel Webster, who's a senator from Massachusetts, kind of started talking about how states' rights were almost treasonous. Because what was happening in this nullification issue was that South Carolina and these other southern states were saying that if a state didn't like a federal law, they could nullify it and just not follow it. Well, many people felt that that wasn't correct. But Senator Robert Hayne from South Carolina tries to ally the South with the West to argue for states' rights. In fact, with this nullification issue, South Carolina even starts to threaten secession, as kind of led by John Calhoun. So this really kind of shows the rift between the vice president and the president. Well, what eventually happens is that even though a slightly lower tariff was passed in 1832, as South Carolina nullifies this tariff, Jackson gets Congress to pass what becomes known as the Force Bill, which authorizes actual invasion of South Carolina of federal troops to enforce the tariff. Well, as it plays out eventually, a lower tariff is passed. South Carolina nullifies actually the Force Bill as well after having rescinded their first nullification bill. So you really see the beginning of states' rights versus federal government, which one kind of wins out. It kind of really becomes quite messy. But there was no way Jackson was going to allow the Union to be disbanded or to let a country secede, which really kind of sets the precedent that Lincoln would use to oppose secession in the 1860s. But shortly after dealing with this nullification crisis, the Jackson administration has to deal with another issue. This time it's known as the Peggy Eaton Affair or the Petticoat Affair. And as shown by this picture, it actually culminates by 1831 with Jackson dismissing basically his whole cabinet. These rats that were scurrying around. Now, what could kind of lead to Jackson dismissing his entire cabinet? Well, it all kind of stems from his Secretary of War, John Eaton, and his wife, Peggy Eaton. And what had happened was that the other cabinet members' wives kind of shunned Peggy and wouldn't allow her into their circle and kind of question her social standing and her background a little bit. And this painfully reminded Jackson of the troubles his wife Rachel went through and the attacks upon her. And because John Eaton supported Rachel and Andrew during their tough time, Jackson, being a loyal friend, was going to kind of pay John Eaton and Peggy Eaton back. And he stood by their side. It kind of shows his honor, his duty, his friendship. And because of that, Jackson wasn't going to let his cabinet members' wives treat Peggy like this, and eventually forces them to resign. So it just is kind of another example of Jackson and standing up for what he believes is right. But we'll take a further look at other aspects of Jackson's administration in our next episode.